Fisherman in the open sea finds a giant iceberg with a medieval castle trapped in it. David Thomas adjusted the engine of his fishing boat and looked toward the horizon of the icy waters off the Maine coastline. Something was wrong on that winter morning. After 40 years sailing those waters, he could tell when the sea held surprises. The cold current from the south had brought something different, something that made his heart race even before he could see clearly. "What the hell is that?" he muttered to himself, adjusting his glasses fogged by the sea spray. A few kilometers ahead, a massive white shape emerged from the dark waters like a floating mountain. It wasn't just ordinary ice. There was something more, structures that seemed to defy logic. David Thomas slowed the engine and approached slowly, completely ignoring the safety recommendations he'd learned over decades at sea. The iceberg was immense, much larger than anything he'd ever seen in those waters. But what really caught his attention were the shapes emerging from the center of the icy formation. It looked like an ancient structure with towers and walls resembling a medieval castle, all perfectly preserved in the crystalline ice. "This can't be real," he said aloud, as if speaking the words could make sense of what he was seeing. But it was real. And the closer he got, the more details he could distinguish. There was dark wood visible through the ice, structures that clearly weren't natural. His experienced fisherman's instinct screamed for him to move away, but his curiosity was stronger. David Thomas maneuvered the boat to circle the iceberg, looking for a better angle. That's when he first saw the symbols, carvings in the wood emerging from the ice, signs that seemed familiar, though he couldn't remember where he knew them from. The wind changed direction and brought a strange sound, like a low moan coming from inside the ice. David Thomas felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the biting cold of the sea. There was something about that place that stirred something deep in his memory, a feeling of recognition he couldn't explain. He pulled his cell phone from his waterproof jacket pocket, but as expected, there was no signal at that distance from the coast. He would have to return to port and report what he'd seen. Who would believe him? A simple fisherman reporting the discovery of a frozen medieval castle in the waters of Maine? The current began pushing the iceberg slowly southward. David Thomas realized that if he didn't act soon, this extraordinary discovery could disappear forever into the deep waters of the Atlantic. He needed proof. He needed to document it somehow. With his heart pounding, he decided to get even closer. The waves rocked his fishing boat against the ice, creating a rhythmic sound that echoed through the cold morning air. That's when he noticed an opening in the side of the iceberg, a kind of cavity where water had eroded part of the ice. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. David Thomas tied a rope to the side of his boat and, against all common sense, decided to enter the icy cavity. The water was even colder inside, but he managed to stand in the small vessel while investigating the interior of the formation. What he saw there changed his life forever. Perfectly preserved in the ice were pieces of an ancient wooden vessel. It wasn't a medieval castle, but the wreckage of an old ship that had been captured by the ice decades ago. The structures that looked like towers were actually masts and parts of the hull that had projected strangely during the freezing process. But what truly made his blood run cold were the personal items scattered across the preserved deck. Old clothes, fishing tools he recognized from his grandfather's time, and especially a wooden box with engraved initials he knew very well, W.H., William Harrison. "It can't be," he whispered, his voice echoing through the icy cavity. William Harrison was his grandfather, the man who had mysteriously disappeared 50 years ago when David Thomas was just a child. His mother had always said the old fisherman had left to try his luck in other waters, but had never been heard from again. Now, facing those frozen wreckage, a very different truth began to form in his mind. With trembling hands, he managed to break part of the ice and grab a few objects. A golden pocket watch was perfectly preserved, and when he opened it, he found an engraving that almost made him faint. "To my grandson, David Thomas, may he continue the family tradition with honesty." William Harrison, 1973. Tears froze in his eyes before they could even stream down his face. 50 years later, He had found not only the remains of his grandfather's boat, but also proof that the man had thought of him until the very end. But this raised a terrible question. What had really happened to William Harrison? David Thomas gathered all the objects he could carry and quickly returned to his boat. The Iceberg continued moving slowly, carried by the current. He needed to get back to the port of Rockport and uncover the truth about his grandfather's disappearance. During the return trip, his mind buzzed with questions. Why had his mother never told the truth about what happened? Why was his grandfather's boat preserved in the ice so far from the coast? And most importantly, why was there a growing feeling that someone didn't want this discovery to be made? Upon reaching the port, David Thomas went straight to the town's small maritime museum. The director, Dr. Margaret Thompson, an elegant woman in her 60s, greeted him with a polished smile that soon turned to disdain when he began telling his story. "Mr. Harrison," she said, adjusting her glasses and looking at him with superiority, "I understand that you fishermen spend a lot of time alone at sea, and sometimes imagination can play tricks. But an iceberg with a medieval castle? Please." David Thomas showed the objects he had collected, but the woman examined them quickly and returned them with disinterest. "These old things could have come from anywhere. The sea brings wreckage from all corners of the world. This proves nothing." Frustration grew in David Thomas's chest. He knew what he had seen. He knew those objects belonged to his grandfather, but without academic or scientific credibility, his words seemed like just the fantasies of a lonely fisherman. "You didn't even bother to examine them properly," he said, controlling his anger. "This watch has a specific engraving with a date and name. How do you explain that?" Dr. Margaret sighed impatiently. "Mr. Harrison, we receive dozens of such discoveries every year. Fishermen who find old things and think they've made the discovery of the century. If we were to investigate every one of these stories, we wouldn't get anything else done." David Thomas left the museum determined to prove he was right. If the academic community didn't want to listen to him, he would document his discovery himself. He spent the rest of the day gathering improvised equipment, an underwater camera borrowed from a friend, stronger ropes, and tools for breaking ice. The next day, he returned to the spot where he had found the iceberg. To his relief, the formation was still there, just a few hundred meters south of where he had first seen it. The cold current kept it close to the coast, as if the sea wanted that discovery to be made. This time, David Thomas was better prepared. He managed to enter the icy cavity more securely and document everything with photographs. In the daylight, it became even clearer that these were the wreckage of an old fishing vessel, not very different from the boats still used in the region. It was during this second exploration that he found something even more disturbing. Hidden in a preserved compartment of the boat was a leather-bound journal, protected from moisture by a metal case. The pages were yellowed but perfectly legible. It was his grandfather's journal. The first pages recounted normal fishing expeditions, but as he read further, a troubling pattern began to emerge. William Harrison had discovered something that deeply worried him, something related to the local fishing business that wasn't right. "Today I confirmed my suspicions," said an entry dated June 1973. "The fish being sold at the Central Market aren't fresh as they claim. Some are being preserved with dangerous chemicals. I need to do something, but I don't know who to trust." David Thomas felt his stomach turn. His grandfather had uncovered some kind of fraud in the local fishing industry. That would explain a lot about his sudden disappearance. He continued reading with growing anxiety. The following entries revealed that William Harrison was being threatened by influential people in town, people who wanted him to keep his mouth shut about what he had discovered. "Gerald Carter came to see me today," said another entry. "He said it would be better for me to forget what I saw and just focus on my fishing. But how can I stay silent knowing they're poisoning the families in our community?" David Thomas knew that name. Gerald Carter was now a wealthy and respected businessman in town, owner of several companies related to fishing and maritime tourism. At the time of his grandfather's disappearance, he must have been just a young entrepreneur trying to build his business empire. The last entry in the journal was the most disturbing of all. "I've decided to leave Rockport before something bad happens to me or my family. If anything goes wrong, I hope someone finds these pages one day and uncovers the truth. The ice preserves everything. even the secrets some want to bury forever. David Thomas closed the journal with trembling hands. His grandfather hadn't left voluntarily. He had fled out of fear, fearing for his family's safety, but something had gone wrong during his escape, resulting in that shipwreck preserved in time by the Antarctic ice. Now he understood why his mother always changed the subject when he asked about his grandfather. She knew the truth, or at least part of it, and she probably lived in fear that history would repeat itself. With the journal secure in his hands, David Thomas returned to the harbor, determined to confront his mother about the family's past. Mrs. Dorothy Harrison lived in the same simple house where he had grown up, just a few blocks from the sea. At 75, she still kept the residence immaculate and cooked for her grandchildren whenever they visited. "Mom," he said, entering the kitchen where she was preparing lunch, "we need to talk about my grandfather." Mrs. Dorothy stopped stirring the pot on the stove and turned slowly. Her face grew pale when she saw the journal in her son's hands. "Where did you get that, David Thomas?" "I found it in the wreckage of Dad's boat, preserved in the ice." He placed the journal on the kitchen table. "Now I want you to tell me the truth about what happened 50 years ago." The elderly woman sat down heavily in the chair, as if the weight of decades of secrets had finally become unbearable. "I always knew this day would come," she murmured. "I always knew the ocean couldn't keep its secrets forever." "Did you know he didn't leave voluntarily?" Mrs. Dorothy nodded, tears beginning to form in her tired eyes. "Your grandfather was a good man, David Thomas, too honest for his own good. He discovered things that some people didn't want to be discovered. About the contaminated fish, about much more than that," she sighed deeply. "William found out there was a network of people selling spoiled fish to the poorest families in the region. They would buy cheap, old fish from other cities, treat it with chemicals to make it look fresh, and sell it as if it were local catch." David Thomas sat down beside his mother. "And was Gerald Carter involved?" "He was the mastermind behind it all. Young, ambitious, unscrupulous. Your grandfather tried to report it, but Carter had contacts in City Hall, in the police, everywhere that mattered. Instead of investigating the accusations, they started threatening our family." "Why did you never tell me this?" Mrs. Dorothy wiped her tears with her apron. "Because even after your grandfather disappeared, the threats continued. Carter said that if you or I made any move to investigate William's disappearance, bad things could happen to our family." David Thomas felt a growing anger burning in his chest. For 50 years, his family had lived under the shadow of threats, while the man responsible for his grandfather's disappearance prospered and became a respected figure in the community. "Mother, things have changed. I have proof now. I have Grandpa's diary. I have photographs of the wreckage. We can expose the truth." "No!" Mrs. Dorothy's voice came out louder than she intended. "Carter is even more powerful now than he was before. He has money, influence, contacts everywhere. If you try to mess with him, you'll end up like your grandfather." David Thomas took his mother's hands in his. "Mother, I can't live the rest of my life knowing the truth and doing nothing. Grandpa died trying to protect our community. I can't let his sacrifice be in vain." Mrs. Dorothy looked into her son's eyes and saw the same stubborn determination that had led her husband to confront Gerald Carter decades ago. She knew she wouldn't be able to dissuade David Thomas from his mission, just as she hadn't been able to convince William in the past. "Then be very careful," she said finally. "Carter is a dangerous man, and he won't hesitate to use all the resources he has to protect his reputation." That afternoon, David Thomas decided to investigate more about Gerald Carter before making any decisions. The businessman now controlled a large portion of the region's fishing economy, in addition to having investments in hotels, restaurants, and even the small local newspaper. As he walked through downtown Rockport, observing the businesses that belonged to Carter, David Thomas didn't realize he was being followed. 2 men in a dark car had been tailing him since he left home, always maintaining a safe distance. Gerald Carter had built a network of informants over the years. He knew everything that happened in town, especially when it involved potential threats to his businesses, and David Thomas's discovery of the iceberg definitely qualified as a threat. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Carter received the report about David Thomas's activities in his office on the top floor of a commercial building overlooking the ocean. At 68 years old, he still maintained the imposing posture and calculating gaze that had helped him build his empire. So the grandson of old William finally found what he was looking for, he murmured to himself, flipping through photographs his men had taken of David Thomas visiting the Iceberg. Carter knew this day would eventually come. The sea sometimes returned things that should have remained lost forever, but he had prepared for this possibility for decades. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. "Sarah, it's your father. I need you to come to my office this afternoon. We have a delicate situation to resolve." Sarah Carter was the only daughter of Gerald and had grown up believing her father was a respectable and honest businessman. At 32, she worked as a history teacher at the local school and maintained strong moral values that sometimes conflicted with the questionable practices she occasionally observed in her father's business. "What's going on, Dad?" she asked as she entered the luxurious office a few hours later. Gerald told her an edited version of the situation, explaining that a local fisherman was trying to cause trouble for the family with unfounded accusations based on old documents that could easily be forged. "I need you to help me handle this situation diplomatically," he said. "Perhaps it would be best if you spoke with this David Thomas. You're around the same age and he might be more receptive to a friendly approach." Sarah wasn't comfortable with the request, but agreed to help out of family loyalty. She didn't know she was being used as a pawn in her father's game to control the situation. Meanwhile, David Thomas decided he needed professional help to handle the evidence he had collected. He remembered Dr. Stephen Richards, a retired lawyer who had gained a reputation for his integrity during decades of practice in the region. Dr. Stephen lived in a simple but elegant house in the historic center of Rockport. At 70 years old, he still maintained a sharp mind and a sense of justice that had earned him respect, even from his opponents during his career. "David Thomas," the old lawyer said as he opened the door, "I haven't seen you since your grandmother's funeral. Come in, come in." David Thomas explained his discovery and showed the evidence he had collected. Dr. Stephen examined the documents carefully, adjusting his glasses to read the yellowed pages of the diary. "This is very serious," the lawyer murmured after a few minutes of reading. "If these accusations are true, we're talking about negligence that may have caused health problems in hundreds of families over the years." "Do you believe I can do something with this evidence?" Dr. Stephen leaned back in his leather armchair. "Believing is one thing, proving it legally is another. These documents are very old, and Gerald Carter is a powerful figure in the community. We would need more evidence, preferably something more recent. But it's a start, isn't it? It is. And more importantly, it's the truth." The lawyer looked at David Thomas seriously. "But you need to understand that messing with Gerald Carter is no joke. He has the resources to make your life very difficult. Dr. Stephen, my grandfather sacrificed everything to try to expose the truth. I can't just let it go." The lawyer smiled faintly. "I knew your grandfather, David Thomas. William was a good man, and you've inherited the same moral fiber. Very well, let's see what we can do." In the following days, Dr. Stephen began discreetly investigating the story behind the diary's accusations. He discovered that, indeed, there were medical records from the 1970s showing an unexplained increase in food poisoning cases in the region, especially among low-income families who bought cheaper fish at the central market. At the same time, David Thomas continued visiting the Iceberg, which fortunately remained in the same region due to the specific ocean currents of that time of year. With each visit, he managed to recover more artifacts and documents that strengthened his evidence. It was during one of these expeditions that he noticed he was no longer alone at sea. A larger fishing boat was always in the same area, keeping its distance but clearly observing him. David Thomas recognized the vessel as belonging to Roger and Carl Mitchell, two fisherman brothers known in the region for accepting any job for money. The following night, David Thomas discovered that someone had tampered with his boat. Nothing had been stolen, but it was obvious that someone had been there searching for something. The ropes were tied differently, and his fishing gear was organized in a way he never did. They're trying to intimidate me, he thought, but instead of fear, this only increased his determination. The next day, he decided to take Dr. Stephen Richards to see the iceberg in person. The old lawyer had initially shown skepticism about the preservation of the materials in the ice, but when he saw the perfectly conserved wreckage with his own eyes, his attitude changed completely. "My God," murmured Dr. Stephen Richards, examining the structures visible through the crystalline ice. "It really is your grandfather's boat. I recognize the shape of the hull, the type of wood used. This is exactly how they built fishing vessels back then." They spent hours documenting and photographing everything. Dr. Stephen Richards, despite his age, proved surprisingly agile while exploring the icy cavity. It was he who found the secret compartment where William Harrison had hidden additional documents, including photographs that showed clearly spoiled fish being treated with chemicals before sale. "These photographs are pure gold," said the lawyer, examining the black and white images. "Your grandfather documented everything methodically. He was a very intelligent man." During the way back to the port, Dr. Stephen Richards elaborated a strategy. "We need to make this discovery public before Carter has a chance to act against us. I'll organize a meeting at the city council, invite the regional press, make sure the whole community learns about what we've discovered." "Do you think that will work?" "Honestly, I don't know, but it's our best chance. Once the story becomes public, it will be very difficult for Carter to make it simply disappear." That night, David Thomas received an unexpected visit. Sarah Carter appeared at his door, politely introducing herself and asking to talk about the delicate situation that was worrying her father. Sarah was an attractive woman, with brown hair and intelligent eyes that showed sincerity. She dressed simply but elegantly, like someone who valued substance over appearance. David Thomas invited her in, curious about her intentions. "Mr. Harrison," she began, sitting in the modest but cozy living room, "my father told me about your recent discoveries. He's worried about the possible misunderstandings this could cause in the community." "Misunderstandings?" David Thomas couldn't hide the irony in his voice. "Mrs. Carter, I've found concrete proof that your family has been involved in practices that harmed our community for decades." Sarah seemed genuinely surprised by the vehemence of the response. "Mr. Harrison, my father has always been a respected man in this town. He built businesses that gave jobs to hundreds of families. I'm sure there's a misunderstanding about the events of the past." David Thomas studied the young teacher's face. There was sincerity in her eyes, as if she truly believed what she was saying. This made him realize that Sarah probably didn't know the truth about her father's activities. "Mrs. Carter," he said more gently, "I would very much like to believe your family is innocent. But the evidence I've found is very clear. Your father was involved in selling contaminated fish in the 1970s, and my grandfather disappeared after trying to expose this practice." Sarah shook her head. "That's impossible. My father may have his flaws, but he would never deliberately do something that harmed other people." David Thomas stood up and went to get a copy of the photographs he had found in the iceberg. When he showed them to Sarah, he saw shock and confusion spread across her face. I don't understand," she murmured, examining the images. "Where did these photos come from?" "From my grandfather's boat, preserved in the ice. He documented everything before disappearing." Sarah remained silent for several minutes, studying the photographs with growing horror. As a history teacher, she knew how to recognize authentic documents, and there was something about the quality and style of the photos that suggested they were indeed from the 1970s. If this is true," she finally said, "it means I grew up believing a lie about my own father." David sat down again, realizing Sarah was going through a crisis of family faith. "Look, I don't want to destroy your family. I just want the truth about my grandfather to come out. And what is your intention? What do you plan to do with this evidence?" "Make it public. The community has a right to know what happened." Sarah stood up, clearly disturbed by the conversation. I need to think about all this. Can I keep copies of these photographs?" David hesitated, but something in her sincerity convinced him he could trust her. Yes, you can, but please be careful. There are people who don't want this truth to come out. After Sarah left, David kept thinking about the conversation. There was something in her reaction that made him believe he might have found an unexpected ally in the Carter family. Sarah drove back home in a state of shock. The photographs were on the passenger seat, like physical evidence that her entire life had been built on a lie. The whole way, her mind replayed past conversations with her father, searching for signs that could confirm or deny the accusations. When she got home, Gerald was waiting for her in the living room. "So? Did you manage to convince the fisherman to drop this nonsense?" Sarah looked at her father, seeing him with new eyes. "Dad, I need you to answer a question, and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course, honey, go ahead and ask." "The accusations from David about the contaminated fish in the 1970s, are they true?" Gerald felt his blood run cold. The way Sarah had asked the question, the seriousness in her voice indicated she had seen evidence. "Sarah, you need to understand that business back then was different. There was less regulation, less oversight." "That doesn't answer my question, Dad." Gerald stood up and walked to the window, looking at the sea that had been the backdrop for his successes and his sins. "Times were hard, Sarah. I was young, had a family to support, dreams to fulfill. Sometimes maybe I made choices I wouldn't make today." Sarah felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. "So it's true. You really sold contaminated food to poor families." "It wasn't exactly like that," Gerald tried to explain, but Sarah interrupted him. "And William Harrison? David's grandfather? What happened to him?" Gerald's silence was more eloquent than any answer. Sarah understood that the suspicions about William's disappearance also had merit. "My God," she whispered. "Who are you? Who is my real father?" Sarah left home that night and went for a walk along the beach, trying to process the discovery that her father had been involved in activities she considered morally unacceptable. As a teacher, she had always taught her students about the importance of honesty and integrity. Now she discovered she had grown up in the house of a man who had violated these fundamental principles. During the following days, Sarah began her own investigation into her father's past. She discreetly spoke with elderly people in the community, retired fishermen who might remember the events of the 1970s. Mrs. Evelyn Sanders, an 80-year-old woman who had worked at the fish market for decades, confirmed many of Sarah's suspicions. "I remember those times well," the elderly woman said, shaking her head sadly. "There was something wrong with the fish that came from your father's companies. Many families got sick after buying it, but no one dared to complain because they needed the cheap food. And Mr. William Harrison, do you remember him? How could I forget? He was a good, honest man. He tried to report what was happening, but no one wanted to listen. Then he simply disappeared one night and was never heard from again." Sarah also discovered that there were hospital records from that time showing a significant increase in food poisoning cases, especially among children and the elderly in the poorer areas of the city. The patterns exactly matched the accusations found in William Harrison's diary. The more she investigated, the more convinced she became that David Thomas was right. Her father had been involved in criminal practices that had harmed hundreds of innocent people, and William Harrison had paid with his life for trying to expose the truth. Meanwhile, David Thomas and Dr. Stephen Richards continued strengthening their case. The lawyer had contacted document conservation specialists who confirmed the authenticity of the materials found in the Iceberg. They also managed to get testimonies from people who still remembered the events of the 1970s. The iceberg began to show signs of faster melting. Temperature changes and ocean currents were affecting its stability. David Thomas knew they had little time to extract all possible evidence before that frozen archive of history disappeared forever. It was during one of his last visits to the iceberg that David Thomas found what he considered to be the most important evidence of all, an unsent letter his grandfather had written to him, dated the day before his disappearance. "My dear grandson David Thomas," the letter said in shaky handwriting, "if you are reading this, it means my plan to expose the corruption in our community failed, and something bad happened to me. I want you to know that everything I did was to protect the innocent families who were being harmed by the greed of unscrupulous men. The sea preserves all things, David Thomas, including the truth. If you ever have the chance to continue the fight I started, do so with courage but also with wisdom. Do not let the pursuit of justice make you as bitter as those you fight. Always remember that a man's true worth lies in his ability to protect the weakest. With all my love and hope for a better future, your grandfather, William Harrison. David Thomas had to stop reading several times to control his emotions. 50 years later, his grandfather's words reached him as both a blessing and a challenge. He knew he had found not only evidence of a crime, but also a legacy of moral principles he should carry for the rest of his life. That same night, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She went to David Thomas's house and, to his surprise, brought a box full of old documents. "These are my father's correspondence from the 1970s, she explained, her eyes red from crying. "I found them in his personal files. I think you'll want to see this." David Thomas examined the documents with Dr. Stephen Richards, who had been called to witness the delivery. Among the papers were letters from questionable suppliers, receipts for fish purchases of dubious origin, and most importantly, a series of threatening letters directed at William Harrison. "This is incredible," murmured Dr. Stephen Richards. "This is direct evidence of Gerald Carter's involvement in the scheme, and it also confirms he was behind the threats to your grandfather." Sarah was clearly devastated by the betrayal of her own values. "All my life I believed my father was a man of integrity. How can I go on living knowing our fortune was built on the suffering of other people?" David Thomas felt compassion for the young teacher. "Sarah, you're not responsible for your father's mistakes, but now you have the chance to help correct a historical injustice." "That's what I intend to do," she said with determination. "I will help you expose the truth, whatever it takes." Dr. Stephen Richards organized a public meeting at the City Council for the following week. He invited representatives from the regional press, community leaders, and all citizens interested in learning about an important historical discovery concerning the local fishing community. Gerald Carter learned about the meeting through his contacts in the city administration. When he discovered that Sarah was collaborating with David Thomas, he became furious. He tried to convince her to change her mind, using a combination of emotional blackmail and subtle threats. "Sarah, you're destroying our family," he said, during a tense confrontation at his mansion. "Everything I've built, everything I've worked for over decades will be lost because of events that happened 50 years ago. Dad, innocent people were harmed. Families suffered because of your choices. How can I pretend that didn't happen? Because it's water under the bridge. Because stirring up the past won't benefit anyone." Sarah looked at her father with sadness and disappointment. "It will bring justice. It will bring the truth. And it will honor the memory of a good man who died trying to protect our community." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Gerald realized he had lost control of the situation. His own daughter was working against him, and the evidence was too strong to simply ignore or discredit. He needed a different strategy. In the days leading up to the public meeting, Gerald tried to use his influence to cancel the event. He called city council members, offered generous donations for municipal projects, and even threatened to withdraw his businesses from the city. But Dr. Stephen Richards had been clever in making the meeting an official city council event, with extensive advance publicity. Meanwhile, David Thomas received several intimidation attempts. His fishing equipment was vandalized, someone put nails in his car tire, and he started receiving anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. But instead of discouraging him, this only confirmed he was on the right track. The most disturbing discovery happened 3 days before the meeting. David Thomas returned to the Iceberg site and found only open water. The formation had completely broken apart during the previous night, taking with it the last physical traces of his grandfather's boat wreckage. "This can't be a coincidence," he said to Dr. Stephen Richards. "Someone accelerated the iceberg's melting to destroy the evidence." The lawyer agreed it was highly suspicious, but reminded them they had already collected sufficient evidence. David Thomas, "Fortunately, we documented everything before this happened. We have photographs, documents, physical objects. The destruction of the iceberg won't prevent our presentation." The night before the public meeting, Sarah received an unexpected visit from her father. Gerald appeared at her apartment, looking as if he had aged years in a matter of days. The weight of the situation was clearly affecting his physical and mental health. "Sarah," he said, sitting heavily on the sofa, "do you really intend to publicly humiliate me tomorrow?" Sarah studied her father's tired face. "It's not about humiliation, Dad. It's about justice." "Justice?" Gerald laughed bitterly. "You want to know about justice? I grew up poor, Sarah. My parents had nothing. I worked since I was 12 to help support our family. When I finally had the chance to prosper, yes, maybe I made some questionable decisions. But it was so my daughter could have a better life, at the expense of other families' health and safety. Things were different back then. There weren't the regulations that exist today. I wasn't the only one making that kind of deal." Sarah shook her head. "That doesn't justify anything, Dad. And it certainly doesn't justify what happened to Mr. William Harrison." Gerald remained silent for several minutes. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with decades of suppressed emotion. "William Harrison was a stubborn man. I tried to convince him to leave the past behind, offered him compensation to forget what he had seen, but he refused. So you threatened him. I warned him about the consequences of trying to destroy businesses that supported half the families in town. And when he wasn't intimidated," Gerald closed his eyes, as if reliving a painful memory, "he set out on a stormy night against all warnings about sea conditions. I never thought anything bad would actually happen to him. But you knew he was leaving in fear. You knew you had forced a good man to abandon his family. I was young, Sarah, ambitious, thought I was protecting my future. I didn't realize at the time how much I was hurting other people." Sarah felt a mix of anger and pity for her father. "Dad, you've had 50 years to correct this mistake, 50 years to do the right thing, and instead you built an empire on this lie." Gerald rose slowly, seeming to carry the weight of decades of guilt. "So, this is how it's going to be? You're going to tear apart your own family to defend the honor of a man who died 50 years ago." "I'm going to do what's right," Sarah said firmly, "something that should have been done long ago." After her father left, Sarah stayed up all night preparing her testimony for the next day's meeting. She knew her words would change not only her relationship with her father, but also the entire social dynamic of the community. The day of the public meeting dawned cloudy and cold. The city council was packed with curious residents, regional press representatives, and fishing rights activists who had traveled from other cities to attend the event. David Thomas arrived early, accompanied by his mother, Mrs. Dorothy. The elderly woman was nervous but determined to finally honor her husband's memory publicly. Dr. Stephen Richards carefully organized all the evidence on a table in the center of the auditorium. Sarah entered quietly through the side door, avoiding eye contact with people she knew. She knew that after that morning, many in the community would see her differently. Gerald Carter didn't show up. Dr. Stephen opened the presentation by explaining how David Thomas had discovered the wreckage preserved in the Iceberg. He showed photographs of William Harrison's boat, displayed the documents found, and read excerpts from the diary detailing the questionable practices of the 1970s. The audience listened in growing silence as the story unfolded. Many elderly people nodded in recognition, remembering events and situations that now made sense within the larger context. When Dr. Stephen called Sarah to testify, a murmur ran through the auditorium. Everyone knew Sarah Carter as Gerald's daughter, and her presence there indicated something extraordinary. "My name is Sarah Carter," she began, her voice clear despite the visible tension. "I am the daughter of Gerald Carter, and I am here today to confirm the truth of the accusations presented against my father." The silence in the auditorium became absolute. Sarah continued, "I found in my father's personal archives documents that prove his involvement in the scheme to sell contaminated fish in the 1970s. I also found correspondence showing that he directly threatened William Harrison to prevent him from exposing these practices." She opened a folder and began reading excerpts from the most incriminating letters. One of them, dated August 1973, clearly stated, "Harrison, last chance. Forget what you saw and focus on your own fishing. Men who are too curious sometimes have accidents at sea. A collective gasp echoed through the auditorium. The threat was explicit and unequivocal. Sarah concluded her testimony with a choked voice. I grew up believing my father was a man of integrity. Discovering this truth has been devastating for me personally, but the community deserves to know what really happened. William Harrison was a hero, not a deserter. He died trying to protect all of us. After the formal presentation, Dr. Stephen opened the floor for questions and testimonies from the community. Several elderly people stood up to share their memories of the events of the 1970s. Mrs. Evelyn Sanders, whom Sarah had interviewed, publicly confirmed the health problems her family had faced after consuming fish from Gerald Carter's suppliers. My youngest son was hospitalized for a week with poisoning, she said, with a trembling voice. The doctors at the time couldn't explain the cause, but now I understand what happened. Mr. Benjamin Foster, an 85-year-old retired fisherman, remembered William Harrison fondly. He was a man of his word, honest as they come. I always suspected something bad had happened to him. William wasn't the type of person who would abandon his family voluntarily. As the testimonies piled up, it became clear that the community had suspected for decades that something wasn't right about William Harrison's disappearance and Gerald Carter's businesses. But Carter's power and influence had silenced these suspicions over the years. The representative from the regional newspaper asked several technical questions about the authenticity of the evidence. Dr. Stephen was prepared and presented expert reports confirming the legitimacy of the documents and objects found in the iceberg. When the meeting ended, more than 4 hours later, the lives of everyone present had changed. The truth about events that had secretly shaped their community for decades had finally come to light. David Thomas was surrounded by people offering support and sharing their own memories about his grandfather. Mrs. Dorothy Harrison cried tears of relief, finally able to speak publicly about the husband she had lost so traumatically. Sarah left the auditorium quickly, avoiding the crowd of journalists who wanted to interview her. She knew she would still have to deal with the consequences of her revelations, especially regarding her relationship with her father. In the following days, the story gained regional attention. Newspapers from Portland and other major cities covered the case as an example of how small communities sometimes hide secrets that affect entire generations. Gerald Carter initially tried to deny the accusations through lawyers, but the evidence was overwhelming and included his own correspondence. After a week of growing public pressure, he finally agreed to hold a press conference. The conference took place in the main hall of the town's most luxurious hotel, owned by Gerald. He appeared visibly aged, accompanied by a team of lawyers who tried to control the format of the presentation. I want to start by apologizing to the Harrison family and everyone in the community who may have been affected by my decisions in the 1970s, said Gerald, reading from a prepared statement. I was young and inexperienced in business. I made judgment errors that I now recognize as serious. A journalist asked directly, Mr. Carter, did you threaten William Harrison to silence him about your questionable business practices? Gerald hesitated before answering. There were tense conversations between us about different views on how to run the fishing business. I may have used words that I now consider inappropriate. Is that a yes? It's an acknowledgement that I didn't handle the situation in the best way possible. Sarah watched the press conference on television in her apartment, feeling a mix of sadness and relief. Her father was finally publicly admitting his guilt, even if evasively. The journalist insisted, Mr. Carter, the evidence suggests you were aware you were selling contaminated food products. How do you justify that? Gerald removed his glasses and wiped his face with a handkerchief. The weight of decades of secrets was clearly affecting his ability to maintain composure. You don't understand how things were back then. There weren't the regulations that exist today. Everyone in the industry took shortcuts to keep prices competitive. Shortcuts that harmed the health of hundreds of families? It was never my intention to harm anyone. I was a young businessman trying to survive in a difficult market. The press conference continued for over an hour, but Gerald provided no significant details beyond vague admissions of judgment errors. His lawyers had clearly advised him to admit minimal guilt while avoiding statements that could result in lawsuits. After the press conference, Dr. Stephen Richards spoke with David Thomas about the next steps. Legally, it will be difficult to sue Gerald for events that happened 50 years ago, but morally, the community has already judged and condemned his actions. What about my family? Have we finally cleared my grandfather's name? Completely. From now on, William Harrison will be remembered as a hero who tried to protect his community, not as a man who abandoned his family. In the following months, several significant changes occurred in Rockport. The Maritime Museum, pressured by public opinion, created a permanent exhibition about the region's fishing history, with special emphasis on William Harrison's courage and the importance of integrity in business. Dr. Margaret Thompson, the museum director, who had initially dismissed David Thomas, publicly apologized and offered to personally organize the exhibition. "I made a serious mistake by not taking the evidence presented by Mr. Harrison seriously," she said during the exhibition's opening. "This situation taught me about the importance of listening to all voices in our community, regardless of their social position." Sarah Carter made a radical decision. She donated her inheritance from the family fortune to a fund aimed at improving public health services in the region. "I cannot accept money that was earned at the expense of other people's suffering," she explained. "I hope this donation can, in some way, make up for part of the damage caused." Sarah's decision was widely praised by the community, but it also created a permanent rift between her and her father. Gerald tried several times to reconcile with his daughter, but Sarah kept her distance, stating that she needed time to process her own issues about family and identity. David Thomas used the notoriety of his discovery to become an advocate for the rights of artisanal fishermen in the region. He began working with non-governmental organizations to ensure fair and transparent practices in the local fishing industry. He also started an annual tradition. Every September 15th, the anniversary of his grandfather's disappearance, he organized a ceremony at the harbor to honor the memory of William Harrison and reaffirm the community's commitment to honesty and transparency. Mrs. Dorothy, at 75 years old, finally found peace after decades of forced silence. "For 50 years I carried the burden of not being able to speak the truth about my husband," she said during an interview with the local newspaper. "Now I can die in peace, knowing that William's memory has been restored and that our community knows the truth." Gerald Carter sold most of his businesses and moved to another city. Some said he could no longer live with the weight of constant social judgment. Others believed he had finally developed awareness of the harm his past actions had caused. Before leaving, he made one last attempt to reconcile with Sarah. He appeared at her apartment on a rainy night, bringing a box of old family photographs. "Sarah," he said, "I know you may never forgive me for what I did, but I want you to know that, despite all my mistakes, I never doubted my love for you. Everything I built thinking of giving you a better life." Sarah looked at her father with sadness. "Dad, I know you love me, but love doesn't justify harming innocent people. You had 50 years to do the right thing and you chose silence. What if I could go back and change everything? But you can't. And now we have to live with the consequences of the choices each of us made." Gerald nodded, seeming to finally accept that he had lost his daughter forever. "Take care, Sarah. You are a better person than I ever was." After he left, Sarah continued her work as a teacher, but now with a different perspective on the importance of teaching ethics and social responsibility to young people. Her history classes became known in the region for how they connected past events with contemporary moral issues. She also developed an unexpected friendship with David Thomas. United by the shared experience of discovering painful truths about their families, they supported each other during the process of adapting to new realities. "It's strange," Sarah said to David during a walk on the beach 6 months after the public meeting, "how one discovery can completely change our perception of ourselves and the people we love." David watched the waves breaking on the sand. "My mother always said the sea can't keep secrets forever. Eventually, everything comes to the surface." "Do you regret moving forward with the investigation? Exposing the truth even knowing the damage it would cause?" David thought for a moment before answering. "No. My grandfather died defending principles he believed in. If I had chosen silence, I would have betrayed everything he fought for." "What about your relationship with the community? Has it changed after all this? It changed for the better. Before I was just David Thomas, the fisherman. Now I am David Thomas, the grandson of William Harrison. I carry a legacy of integrity that motivates me to be a better person every day. Sarah smiled slightly. It's funny how sometimes we need to lose our illusions about the past to find our true identity in the present. Their friendship deepened over time. Sarah often accompanied David Thomas on his fishing expeditions, finding peace in the waters that had revealed so many secrets. He, in turn, helped her establish educational programs about marine conservation in local schools. Dr. Stephen Richards continued working pro bono on cases related to the rights of artisanal fishermen, inspired by his experience helping the Harrison family. "This case reminded me why I became a lawyer," he said, "to defend those without a voice against those who abuse power." 2 years after the Iceberg discovery, the fishing community of Rockport had transformed significantly. New regulations were implemented to ensure transparency in the fishing supply chain. Food safety education programs were established, and most importantly, a new culture of accountability developed among local business owners. The exhibition at the Maritime Museum became a popular tourist attraction, not just for the historical artifacts, but for the inspiring story of civic courage it represented. Visitors from across the region came to learn about William Harrison and the man who had risked everything to honor his memory. David Thomas married Caroline Richards, daughter of Dr. Stephen Richards, in a simple ceremony on the beach where his grandfather used to fish. During the ceremony, he made a special promise. "I vow to raise my children with the same values of honesty and courage that my grandfather William demonstrated, even in the face of great adversity." Sarah served as maid of honor, symbolizing how the traumatic events had created unexpected bonds of friendship and mutual respect between families that might have remained eternal enemies. Mrs. Dorothy, now 78 years old, became a revered figure in the community. She was often invited to speak in schools about the importance of standing up for the truth, even when it requires great personal sacrifice. "My husband always said the sea may hide many things, but it can never hide the truth forever," she would tell young students. Courage isn't the absence of fear, but doing the right thing despite fear. During one such talk, a student asked, "Mrs. Dorothy, do you still feel anger toward Mr. Carter for what he did?" The elderly woman considered carefully before answering. "Anger is an emotion that consumes whoever carries it. I've learned it's better to focus energy on honoring the memory of those we love than on holding grudges against those who have harmed us. But would you forgive him if he sincerely apologized? Forgiveness is a personal choice, dear, but justice is a community necessity. I might eventually forgive Gerald Carter for the mistakes he made, but our community should never forget the lessons we learned from these events." 3 years after the Iceberg discovery, David Thomas received an unexpected letter. It was from Gerald Carter, who was living in a small town inland and working as a consultant for small rural producers. "Dear David Thomas," the letter said, "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness or understanding, but I want you to know that not a day goes by that I don't think about your grandfather and the consequences of my actions. I'm trying to use my remaining years to help honest people prosper in their businesses without compromising their values. It's not much, but it's what I can do to try to make up for some of the damage I caused. I wish you and your family all the happiness you deserve. With respect, Gerald Carter." David Thomas showed the letter to his wife Caroline and to Sarah. Everyone agreed it seemed sincere, but they also recognized that words, however well-intentioned, couldn't undo decades of damage. "It's a start," said Sarah. "At least it shows he finally understood the gravity of what he did." "Do you plan to respond?" asked Caroline. David carefully folded the letter. "Perhaps one day, when I'm ready for it. But now my focus is on building a future based on the values my grandfather stood for, not on stirring up the past." That same year, David and Caroline had their first child, a boy they named William Harrison Richards. During the baptism at the local church, David made a silent promise to his grandfather that the new generation would grow up knowing the truth about his heroic legacy. The baby was blessed not only by the priest, but also by Mrs. Dorothy, who held her great-grandson with tears of joy in her eyes. "William," she whispered to the child, "you carry the name of a very brave man. I hope you also have the courage to stand up for the truth when your time comes." Sarah, who had become the boy's honorary aunt, promised to tell him stories about how truth can be more powerful than any force when defended by courageous people. 5 years after the discovery of the iceberg, Rockport's transformation was visible in many aspects. The local fishing industry thrived under new ethical standards. Tourism had grown, attracted by both the natural beauty and the town's inspiring story of civic integrity. David became president of the region's Artisanal Fishermen's Association, always advocating for sustainable and transparent practices. His reputation for honesty made him a respected voice in fishing-related matters throughout the state. Sarah continued teaching, but also wrote a book about the experience of discovering painful truths about one's own family. The book, titled "Daughter of the Storm: A Journey from Denial to Truth," became required reading at several universities studying business ethics and social responsibility. Dr. Stephen, at 75, was honored by the Bar Association for his pro bono work defending traditional communities. During his acceptance speech, he mentioned the Harrison Carter case as an example of how the judicial system can serve social justice when lawyers commit to ethical principles. Mrs. Dorothy lived to see the birth of 3 great-grandchildren, all raised knowing the heroic story of their great-great-grandfather William Harrison. She passed away at 82 in her sleep, after a life that had finally found peace and resolution. During her funeral, hundreds of people came to honor not only Mrs. Dorothy, but also the Silver family's legacy of courage. David read a letter she had written to be opened after her passing. "Dear children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren," the letter said in her shaky handwriting, "I have lived long enough to see truth triumph over lies, justice over corruption, and love over hatred. The greatest gift you can give me is to continue standing up for these values, even when it requires sacrifices. Always remember, the sea may be deep and its currents strong, but truth is even more powerful. It always finds a way to the surface. With all my eternal love, Dorothy Harrison." After the funeral, David walked alone to the pier where he used to depart for his fishing expeditions. The sea was calm that afternoon, reflecting the golden sunset sky. He thought about his grandfather, his grandmother, and how their lives had been shaped by events that happened long before he was born. Sarah joined him at the pier, carrying little William Harrison in her arms. The child, now 3 years old, loved watching the waves and asking questions about the fishing boats. "Uncle David," said the boy in his childish voice, "tell me again the story about the great-grandfather who became a hero." David Thomas smiled and picked up the boy in his arms. "Once upon a time there was a very brave fisherman named William Harrison. He lived in a beautiful town near the sea and discovered that some bad people were doing things that harmed the families in the community." As he told the family story to a new generation, David Thomas reflected on how the discovery of the iceberg had transformed not only his life, but the entire community. He had learned that the truth, no matter how painful, is always preferable to the comfortable lie. Sarah listened to the story she knew well, but which never lost its emotional impact. She had found purpose in her own journey of discovery, becoming an advocate for transparency and social responsibility in all aspects of community life. 10 years after the discovery of the iceberg, Rockport had become a model for other fishing communities on how to handle issues of business integrity and social justice. Universities sent students to study the Rockport transformation as an example of how historical truths can catalyze positive contemporary changes. David Thomas, now 55 and a father of 3, continued fishing in the same waters where his grandfather had made his final journey. But now, those waters represented not only livelihood, but also a legacy of courage and integrity that he was determined to preserve. On a particularly clear morning, while preparing his fishing net, David Thomas saw something that made him smile. A group of dolphins had appeared near his boat, jumping and playing in the crystal-clear waters. It was a sight his grandfather had also described in his diary as a sign that the sea was healthy and clean. "Thank you, Grandpa," murmured David Thomas to the wind. for teaching me that some things are worth more than our own safety, for showing that a simple man can make a difference when he has the courage to stand up for what is right. The waves gently lapped against the hull of his boat, as if the sea itself was whispering its approval. David Thomas knew he had honored his grandfather's memory, not only by uncovering the truth, but by living according to the values that William Harrison had upheld until the last day of his life. 15 years after the discovery of the iceberg, the story of William Harrison had become a legend in the region. Children grew up hearing about the brave fisherman who had faced powerful forces to defend his community. Local business owners cited his example when facing ethical dilemmas, and artisanal fishermen invoked his memory when they needed courage to defend sustainable practices. David Thomas, now recognized as a community leader and environmental advocate, was often invited to speak at conferences on sustainable fishing and corporate social responsibility. He always began his talks the same way. My grandfather was a simple fisherman who believed that some truths are too important to be silenced. He had no formal education, money, or political power, but he had something more powerful, the courage to stand up for what was right, even knowing it could cost him everything he valued. Sarah, now the principal of the local school, had implemented an innovative curriculum that combined environmental education with social ethics. Her former students often returned to thank her for teaching them not just academic facts, but also moral values that guided them in their adult lives. The exhibition at the Maritime Museum had expanded to include an interactive section where visitors could simulate the ethical dilemmas that William Harrison had faced. The exhibition always ended with the same question. Faced with pressure from powerful forces, would you have the courage to defend the truth? One day, 20 years after the iceberg discovery, David Thomas received an unexpected visit. It was a young journalist from New York, interested in writing a book about stories of civic courage in the United States interior. "Mr. Harrison," said the journalist, "your story has become an inspiration for people across the country. How does it feel knowing your grandfather's discovery continues influencing new generations?" David Thomas, now with graying hair but still strong from years of working at sea, considered the question carefully. It wasn't just a discovery. It was a revelation about the power ordinary people have when they decide to fight for the truth. My grandfather wasn't special because he was different from us. He was special because he chose to do the right thing when it would have been easier to remain silent. And what's the most important lesson you'd want people to learn from this story? David Thomas looked out the window at the sea that had shaped his life and his family's life for generations. That truth has its own power. It can stay hidden for decades, preserved like ice, but eventually always finds a way to the surface. And when it does, it can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. The journalist spent a week in Rockport, interviewing people who had witnessed the town's transformation. Everyone had different stories, but one common theme emerged: the importance of defending moral principles, even in the face of significant adversity. Sarah, now 52 and recognized as one of the state's most respected educators, shared her perspective. "I grew up believing I knew my father. Discovering the truth was devastating, but also liberating. I learned that our identity isn't determined just by our family heritage, but by the choices we make every day." Dr. Stephen, retired, but still mentally sharp at 85, offered a legal perspective. "This case taught me that justice isn't just about courts and sentences. Sometimes true justice happens when an entire community decides it will no longer tolerate unethical behavior." The resulting book from these interviews, titled "Currents of Truth: How a Discovery in the Ice Transformed a Community," became a national bestseller. Schools throughout the United States began using the story as educational material about citizenship and social responsibility. 25 years after the iceberg discovery, David Thomas decided to organize a special event to mark the anniversary. He invited people from across the region to celebrate the memory of William Harrison and the values he had defended. The celebration included a ceremony launching a new vessel, built using traditional techniques but incorporating modern sustainability technologies. The vessel was named William Harrison and would be used for educational programs about responsible fishing. During the ceremony, young William Harrison, now 23, and a graduate in marine biology, gave an emotional speech. "I carry the name of a man I never met personally, but who influenced every day of my life. My great-grandfather taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to do what's right despite fear." Sarah, now a grandmother of 2 grandchildren, watched the ceremony with satisfaction. She had found purpose in her journey of discovery and had dedicated her life to ensuring future generations understood the importance of personal integrity. Gerald Carter had passed away 2 years earlier, in relative anonymity in the small town where he had settled. His final years had been dedicated to volunteer work with small producers, trying to make up for the mistakes of his youth. He never fully reconciled with Sarah, but left a final letter expressing genuine regret and admiration for the moral courage she had shown. The letter was read during a private ceremony, only for the Harrison family and a few close friends. His final words were, "I hope history judges not only my mistakes, but also the efforts I made to try to correct them. May my daughter Sarah be remembered for the courage I never had." 30 years after the Iceberg discovery, Rockport had become a center of excellence in sustainable fishing and corporate social responsibility. The State University had established a satellite campus in the town, offering courses in marine conservation and business ethics. David Thomas, now 65, had been elected to the city council, where he continued advocating for policies that balanced economic development with social responsibility. His 3 children pursued careers related to the sea. William as a marine biologist, Mary Dorothy as an attorney specializing in environmental law, and Peter Stephen as a naval engineer focused on sustainable technologies. The house where Mrs. Dorothy had lived was transformed into a cultural center, offering educational programs about local history and civic values. Visitors from around the world came to learn how a small community had transformed through commitment to truth and justice. Sarah, at 72, had written several books on ethical education and continued giving lectures about the importance of questioning authority when necessary. Her autobiography, Between Loyalty and Truth, became required reading in ethics courses at universities across the country. On a particularly beautiful morning, David Thomas decided to make one last trip to the location where he had discovered the iceberg 3 decades earlier. Accompanied by his children and grandchildren, he sailed to the coordinates he had forever memorized. The waters were calm and crystal clear. There were no more signs of the iceberg that had changed so many lives, but David Thomas knew its legacy remained in the people who had been inspired by William Harrison's story of courage and integrity. "Grandpa," said young William Harrison, now 33 and father of 2 children, "tell my children the story of how you found great-grandfather's treasure." David Thomas smiled, realizing how the story had evolved in the family's oral tradition. "It wasn't exactly a treasure, my son. It was something much more valuable. The truth." He began telling the story once more, watching how William Harrison's great-grandchildren listened with complete attention. He knew they would grow up carrying not only their ancestors' names, but also the values they had stood for. The waves gently rocked the boat as David Thomas narrated the events that had begun with an impossible discovery and ended with an entire community's transformation. He looked at Sarah, who had joined the family for this special expedition, and saw in her face the same determination she had shown decades earlier when choosing truth over blind family loyalty. The sun began to set, painting the sky with golden and orange hues that reflected on the calm water. David Thomas ended the story the same way he always did. "And so you've learned that even the thickest ice cannot hide the truth forever. The sea preserves all important things, waiting for the right moment to reveal them." His grandchildren promised to tell the same story to their own children, ensuring that the memory of William Harrison would continue to inspire future generations to defend the truth, even in the face of the greatest adversities. As they sailed back to the harbor, David Thomas reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with an impossible ice formation and had resulted in a transformation that would last for generations. He had learned that some discoveries do more than change our lives. They reveal who we truly are and who we have the potential to become. The boat's engine hummed softly as they returned to the familiar harbor, carrying with them not just memories, but a living legacy of courage, integrity, and love for the truth that would continue to shape their lives and the lives of those who came after them. The harbor lights began to appear on the horizon, signaling the end of another day at sea, but also the beginning of another evening, where the story of William Harrison would be told, remembered, and celebrated by those who understood that some truths are too important to be forgotten. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of this moving story of courage and discovery. Do you believe David Thomas made the right choice in exposing the truth, even knowing the risks? And Sarah, did she have the courage to betray her own family in the name of justice? Share your reflections in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Your opinion is very important to us. Don't forget to leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other touching stories like this one. Thank you very much for your company.